Thank you, Will. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Everybody having a good time? Can everybody hear me in the back? It's the trouble you can hear, right? I've been given the honor to speak to you tonight about a couple of things. One, to introduce someone special, and I'll do that in a few minutes. And I've also been asked to provide you an update, kind of a follow-on to last year's remarks about the Enola Gay exhibition, and that subject certainly has occupied almost as much headlines as O.J. Simpson. But the request to discuss or perhaps give an update stems from those Chicago remarks, and the sum and substance of those remarks were a plea at that time for the National Air and Space Museum to get back to basics, preserve the aircraft, give it its honored place in history, and document the contributions of the B-29 and exhibit that aircraft with pride. There were at that time thousands upon thousands of people who were pleading for the very same thing. And I can now stand before you and tell you that the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum has a first-rate presentation of the Enola Gay and the 509th. The aircraft is indeed displayed with taste and pride. The exhibition tells the story of the Enola Gay. It explains how the aircraft was restored. It features a portion of the fuselage, the vertical stabilizer, a propeller, an engine, a cowling, and a replica of Little Boy. Exhibit panels also relate the significant efforts of the 20th, 21st Bomber Commands and the 58th Bomb Wing and their contributions early in the war in the Pacific. I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that exhibit is a credit to each and every one of you, to the members, the families, the relatives, and the descendants of the 509th Composite Group. The exhibition is also a credit to the Smithsonian Institution. And for those of you who have asked me about it, I can tell you that the man in charge, Michael Heyman, must and should take the credit with his leadership for his role in getting the National Air and Space Museum and the Enola Gay properly placed. And like any military unit or major corporation, the man or woman at the top takes the heat or receives the respect for taking charge and successfully concluding a difficult task. The Secretary of the Smithsonian and the men and women who labored long and hard to turn that controversy around deserve our thanks. Now, many of you know that last September I was speaking to you in my capacity, or one of my jobs, as the director of the Airman Memorial Museum. And that I continue to be and I also was at that time heavily involved in producing a documentary called The Men Who Brought the Dawn, that focused on the atomic mission crew members of Boxcar and Enola Gay and the various support groups. And I can tell you that while I am no longer with the Airman Memorial Museum, I am that deep in producing documentaries about the 509th Composite Group and our atomic missions. Our film teams have crisscrossed this country from Washington, D.C. to leftover Utah. In 1 week in Leftover, we filmed in 70 degrees, and the next week it was snowing. That is true. I know a little bit of what you went through. As a result, we have about 70 hours of film, archive interviews, first-person accounts. And that archive, that reservoir of documentary information, provided us with the opportunity to supply a 14.5-minute first-person account from the crew of the Enola Gay that is a portion of the Smithsonian exhibit. And I can tell you with pride that one of the Japanese members of the press said there are two jewels in the National Air and Space Museum of the Enola Gay. One is the Enola Gay, and the other is the crew video. Each of us involved with that project are proud of the accomplishments. The video is available to you, and I'm going to put in a plug for the National Atomic Museum Foundation. That video, that 14-minute video made for the exhibit, is ideal for your grandchildren, the classroom for you teachers or retired teachers, and it is available through the gift shops at the National Atomic Museum and through their outlet here in the hotel. Our film efforts to date have also produced or helped produce a documentary effort that was broadcast in France and Germany on August 4th and 5th. I can also tell you it's already been nominated for some awards, and it included folks like Felix Thornhill, I know he's here, Dick Cannon, Don Albury, Jack Lansdale, Dick Ashworth, Paul Tibbets, and others. And our other big project, that full-length feature documentary entitled The Men Who Brought the Dawn, we're hoping for a late fall broadcast. Now, Mike, my second task tonight is to bring to the microphone a gentleman many of you know as the Colonel. Some of you know him as Paul. And that introduction, they say, comes about 50 years late. Some of you were introduced to him in Window. That was 50 years ago, long before this wide body was a gleam in my daddy's eye. For I, like many of you here assembled, would not have been here had it not been for the members of the 509th and the crews of those aircraft and the ground crews. The 509th's dedication to duty, your service to this great nation, your contributions to the 509th, and your loyalty to the commander, help bring about success, victory, and peace. For just a moment, I'd like to focus on that one word, that one very rare commodity called loyalty. Loyalty is indeed a rare commodity. It is belief, trust, and faith in a job, a cause, or an individual. It's something, a belief in a commander or an employer, a spouse, a parent, or a child. It's a trait we all must have to be happy, to have self-esteem, to be productive, and to be a successful leader. But loyalty is not a one-way street. There must be loyalty up that organizational ladder and loyalty down that chain of command. And each and every link in that chain of command must be as strong as the next. And in the 509th Composite Group, there were no weak links. You were all committed to a national cause, a unit, mission, a commander, and your very own strong code of ethics. And loyalty made the 509th the successful unit that the nation, our enemies, and the world recognizes for delivering the knockout punches that ended World War II. Now, I've spoken from the rostrum and on television and radio a few times, and I've tried to communicate several points that our educational system seems to have forgotten or seems to have selectively ignored. People make history. Machines don't. The Enola Gay would never have gotten off the ground if it had not been for the support personnel of the 509th Composite Group. And no one knows it more than your commander. People make history, not machines or devices. The gimmicks, the weapons that decimated Hiroshima and Nagasaki were made by men and women for one common cause: to bring the conflict we know as World War II to an end, for victory. And make no mistake about it, the men and women of the 509th, the Manhattan Project and the 509th significantly shortened the end of the war and spared many American and Japanese lives. This nation owes the 509th Group, as a unit, a thank you for the service and as a commitment to excellence for its loyalty to this nation. As for the commander, he built a team of men who we could count on. Tom Klassen, the deputy commander, kept the unit on track when his commander, Paul Tibbets, was out traveling and doing the things that he had to do. The headquarters staff of Jerry Bean, Jim Hopkins, Tom Farabee, and Dutch Van Kirk all had key responsibilities. John Porter's 390th Air Service Group, George Westcott's Headquarters and Service Base Squadron, and Guy Geller's 1027th Air Materiel Squadron. Chuck Sweeney's 393rd Bomb Squadron, and John Casey's 320th Troop Squadron. Earl Casey's always always resourceful 603rd Air Engineering Squadron, and Charlie Begg's 1st Ordnance Squadron, and Louis Schaefer's highly competitive 1395th Military Police Company, and Louis Schaefer, or I can tell you they're still talking about you in window. All had high standards that made the 509th the best of the best. Now, I've mentioned some officers and some units, but none of them would be worth a flip if it had not been for the enlisted man. And I'd like every enlisted man in here to stand right now and have the officers say thank you. I learned real early in my young military career that the pilot didn't own the plane, the crew chief did. He just loaned it. We've been that just stood with the cooks, the bakers, the clerks, the ground crew, and they were the guys from the orderly room to the mess hall to the flight line, and they made it all happen. It was essential for them to keep it up, keep the aircraft going, keep them secure, and keep them flying. Now, as for your commander, just a couple of words. At age 29, he was tasked to assemble the world's first atomic composite group. No one knew how to do it. There was no blueprint, no specific direction, only damn tight requirements. How did this young colonel get the job done? I think we just answered part of that question. It was your loyalty. His credentials were impressive. And some of you don't know some of this, so I'm just going to put it out there for everybody to kind of chew on. In August of 1942, he led the first daylight bombing raid on occupied France from England. And later that month, his crew led the first 100 aircraft daylight raid on occupied France. That fall, in 1944, he was a key factor in the B-29 project. And by September of 1944, there were few men with his experience in working with or flying the B-29. He was leadership tested, combat proven, cocky, confident, and proud. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my very good friend, Brigadier General Paul W. Tibbets.
Thank you, George, for that glowing introduction. I think I deserved every word of it. 509ers, I'm delighted to be here with you tonight. And in that 509ers, I'm talking about the men, I'm talking about the women that back them up, I'm talking about the siblings, I'm talking about the survivors. Everybody is who I am addressing tonight. Now, what I want to do is to try to cover some ground that has not been, should we say, publicized before. There's been a lot of publicity, but I know you all can read, so I'm not going to repeat it. What I would like to do is to start basically at the beginning, and that takes me back to September of 1944, when I was very happily down here at Alamogordo testing the B-29 to defend itself against the fighters, or conversely, the fighters to attack successfully the B-29. This was a project that had been established with the University of New Mexico, and particularly their Department of Physics, headed by Dr. E.J. Workman. We had at that test site, we had all of the American fighters, we had British Spitfires, we had Japanese Zeros, and we had some ME-109s. Now the purpose was to fly this one single B-29 that had been allocated to the project. Somebody didn't realize the mechanical problems inherent, but anyway, that's all they had was one. I had been sent down there to see if I could help get the airplane into the air and get more utility out of it than they were experiencing. Dr. Workman was running behind in his schedule of tests. On this particular day, on a particular day, I should say, that the famous old B-29 with all of its guns, turrets, cameras, and so forth, just refused to operate. It had to have 2 engines changed. They didn't have any engines. I had flown to Alamogordo in an airplane that I had picked up and almost inherited at Wichita when I was running flight tests on the B-29 a few months before that. On this particular morning, and now with the mechanics in here, that airplane had a glaring red X on it. But Dr. Workman was beside himself, and he said, "What can we do?" Looking at me. I told him, I said, "Doctor, I have a flying machine out here. It doesn't have any turrets, it doesn't have any cameras, but it's got 4 engines that are running." He said, "Let's get it into the air." The test site was on the edge of the desert, about 30 miles in length. The Workman staff had radio contact with with B-29 and the fighter airplanes, and it also had a radar so that they could keep track of what was going on. Now the object there was to position the fighters into a certain path, let's call it a pursuit curve, that they could follow through as it made its attack on the airplane. It worked real well, and I can't explain it mathematically because I'm not a mathematician, but they really had it worked out quite well. And on this morning that I took that airplane up and flew it, I was thinking about the days in Europe when we used to see fighters come in on us, and I was always fascinated by watching those, you know what I'm going to call them, but I'm not going to do it, watching them come in and close on us, and those guns start to spit fire out. Well, I learned at that particular time that if you could see the tail of that fighter in a pursuit curve, he could not hit you. Now, if you think about it, he's coming in, he's turning in a curve, so if you could see his tail while he's turning, those guns are doing something different. You're throwing deflection into those guns, and that's what I was really interested in, to find out what's going on here. I must tell you that I was failing in my duties with the B-29 because it wasn't very long, maybe an hour after the thing got started, I heard a weak voice say, "Tell him to slow down." Okay, fine. Nobody paid any attention to it, neither did the ground crew. The next plea was just a little bit louder than that. "Tell him to slow down, he's going too fast, my engine's overheating." Well, I looked down at my altimeter where I had supposed to have been flying at 25,000 feet, and not paying any attention to it. As it burned off fuel, it got lighter, and it sought a different altitude and a different airspeed. So up there we are, and I'm at 29,000 when I took a look at it, and I registered that back here in the computer. That is something that is valuable to know. And I think you guys that flew the airplanes that were assigned to the 509th, you understand what I'm talking about. We came out on top of that. Now, I want to get away from that and go to the next, I call it, chronological step. I am just getting out of that airplane on that same day at about noontime when somebody, I don't know who it was, from the area right there came up and said, "You've got a call from General Ent's office." So I rushed into the shack. I answered the phone. The man identified himself. He said, "I'm Colonel so-and-so." He said, "I'm executive officer to General Ent." He wants to see you in his office tomorrow morning at Colorado Springs at 9 o'clock. Bring your B4 bag, you're not going back. Well, strange things happen, I said, yes, sir, and that was the end of that. Now, when I got there the next morning at Colorado Springs, I was expected by the secretary, and I walked in and it gave my name. She said, yes, we've been expecting you. Let me tell General Ince you're here. She punched a button or a lever on the squawk box and announced the fact that I was there, and General Ince's voice came back and said, tell him to wait a minute. He didn't get much more than that out of his mouth when the door opens up to his office, and out comes a lieutenant colonel dressed in an Army uniform, and that uniform was of the Judge Advocate General's office. Well, that's kind of strange. Why is a Judge Advocate General coming out of an Air Corps General's office? But again, things happen in wartime that don't happen any other time. He walked right up to me, stuck his hand out, said, I'm Jack Lansdale. He said, I'd like to ask you a few questions. Let's step over here to the cloak closet, which, headquarters like that had those things for wintertime use when people came in with overcoats and snowshoes on and all that stuff. So it was a pretty good sized room. I don't know, maybe it was 10 by 10, 8 by 8, I don't know. But we walked in there, and he had a dossier under his arm. He laid it down. He started thumbing through. He said, I got a couple of questions to ask you. Well, why did you want to ask me questions? So the first one he asked me, he said, I understand that you went to the University of Cincinnati and was going to be a doctor, and that you lived with a Dr. Harry Crum and his family. I said, yes, I did. They were friends of the family from way back. He said, now, I understood that you said such and such a thing at such and such a time. I don't know what it was. I don't remember today. And I said, well, I probably did. I don't know. I talk to the Crums all the time. He said, okay, fine. He said, you ever been arrested? I said, sure. I said, my old man was good to me. I always had a pretty good automobile. I had a heavy foot. I said, I'd drive around Miami. The cops would pick me up, and he'd take care of it. He said, I don't mean that. Anything more serious? Well, right then and there, I knew this guy knew something. And I knew what he was doing. He was trying to find out if I'd lied to him. I said, sure. He said, what was it? I said, well, one night at such and such a summer month and whatnot, I was over at Surfside, which is north of Miami Beach. And I said, I was over there, and a young lady and I were in the back seat of the car in a compromising position when a flashlight come through the window, and the chief said, you're supposed to do that in hotels. And then he started laughing. He said, okay, I'm satisfied. Let's go to General Ince's office. We walked into General Ince's office. He turned to the general. He said, I'm perfectly happy. Well, Jack Lansdale was General Groves' chief of security. So I got checked out. I found out that they had a dossier on me that had gone back to when I was 8 years old. Now, that's a long way to go. So with all of that, there were two other men in the room. One of them was wearing a Navy uniform, and that was Captain Parsons. Another one, civilian clothes, introduced himself as Norman Ramsey, Dr. Norman Ramsey. He was from Los Alamos. And at that particular time, between Ramsey and Parsons, they gave me a complete briefing on what the Manhattan Project was, where they were located as far as their facilities were concerned, what was going on with atoms and all of those types of things. I got a complete briefing. In the end, Dr. Ramsey said, General Groves has directed us to tell you anything you want to know. He said, I would suggest that you not ask any more than you need to know to do your job. It's just the safest way to play it. I said, I can't argue with that. With that, they left, and shortly after that, General Ince got kind of fatherly with me, and he said, Paul, he said, you have been selected to organize and train the first unit that will be operational using these weapons. He said, I don't know what to tell you other than that. He said, I've got certain instructions that have to be passed on to you. He said, number one, secrecy is the utmost importance. Number two, don't write down anything. You have to remember what goes on. Now, that's a hell of a charge. But I went along with it, and I have done pretty good through most of the years. I've remembered most of the key things. But when he gave me the punchline, I had to stop. He said, now look, I've got a code word here for you that General Arnold has passed down from Washington that will permit you to deal directly with the Pentagon, and in that Pentagon office you will have contact with a colonel by the name of R.C. Wilson, named Bim Wilson. Bim retired as a three-star general. Wilson was in his outer office, and he had been briefed on what this project was. If I ran into trouble using normal channels, I was to contact Wilson, and he would get what I wanted with those requisitions. The other thing that he advised me about, or admonished me, I guess, to consider, he said, you've got a lot of authority. He said, you can do a lot of things. He said, I would only ask you to exercise caution, because if things go bad, you could wind up in prison. Now, if they go good, you could be a hero. Well, you know, that's a good send-off. I left his office following his comment to me. He said, the 2nd Air Force, we will do everything that we can to assist you. We'll handle your personnel requisitions. If you need other type of assistance, we'll help you do that. Because you don't even have a name yet. The 2nd Air Force would do it on their own. And that's how we got this thing started. They did an awful lot of things. But Ant said another thing to me. He said, I can't tell you what to do. You've got to figure these things out for yourself. Nobody can tell you what to do. You're the first lieutenant colonel I've ever seen that doesn't have a boss. Well, that's soaked in. I understood what he meant, and believe me, and I would hope that you fellas will agree with me that about anything that I did, there's one exception, but about anything that I did was right straight down the line. I don't think I abused that business at all, but you know what I abused? When we had to go through whatever board they had in Washington to get things you want. Remember when I got you 12 washing machines? You deserved them. Now, General Ed said, I have selected a squadron, the 393rd Squadron of the 504th Group at Fairmont. He said, they have the best training record of any squadron in training in the Air Force. He said, go take a look at them. If you like them, you can have them. He said, if you don't like them, we'll find you another one. He said, I want you to try 3 different bases as a place to call home and operate from. And those were, once he suggested, and I got to look these up here because I stumble over them all the time. Wendover, Utah, Mountain Home at Boise, Idaho, and Great Bend in Kansas. Those were the 3 bases. When I got through talking to General Ed, I had sufficient time. I mean, I knew my geography reasonably well, and I was in Colorado, so I could get over to Utah in a hurry. I said, well, to myself, I'll get out and I'll go over to Wendover, Utah, and see what they got to offer. And I told the general that. He called the base commander there that was about ready to get out. It had been a P-47 CCTS. I think you know that. And I can't remember the young man's name, but he was very helpful, and he was very positive about Wendover. He said, it's the best base that I've ever been at. Well, when I came over the hills and took a look at it, it didn't look too great to me. But on the other hand, as I got there and I walked around and I thought what the requirement was, I think we could maintain security here. Now, one thing about it, we're not going to be bothered with the visitors. Visitors all want to go to Florida and green and everything like that, so they're not going to be, they're not going to be bothering us. Well, of course, there was also an order out that they were not, nobody was to land at Wendover unless General Ned approved it. And that went for people from Washington as well. I think I spent maybe 3 to 4 hours there. Now, when I went down to Alamogordo to get on this test business, I had been assigned to Grand Island, Nebraska, to teach people how to fly B-29s or how to be instructors. Chuck was there. They were going to be instructors in the B-29 program. One of our first prize students was Curtis E. LeMay. And we had a little trouble convincing him, didn't we? He thought he could fly that airplane at altitude. He thought he could fly it in formation. He thought he could land it, but he found out he couldn't. And when he finally was in such a sweat, he looked at me and he says, "All right, you win. What are we going to do?" That evening there was a barbecue at General Frank Armstrong. He was the commanding general there. General Frank Armstrong's farm he had leased, and I was invited. I went there. While Frank Armstrong was barbecuing steaks and having a beer and visiting, he looked at Frank and he said, "Frank, what are we going to do with these airplanes?" Now, you see, he had been brought back out of Europe to get onto the ones that had gone up to the CBI theater because of all the problems they had had. And he said, well, Frank said, "I really don't know." He said, "Ask Paul." So LeMay looked at me. I didn't know the man. He looked at me. He said, "What do you got to say?" I said, "General," I said, "I had a little bit of experience with firebombs at Eglin Field because I belonged to the Proving Ground Command before I went to Grand Island." And I said, "I think I'd load them all up with firebombs, fly them at low altitude night, and burn the damn place up." He said, "You're crazy as hell." I didn't see him again until I went over there to tell him about the 509th coming over. But I'm getting just a little bit ahead of my story, and let me back up. After I had seen Wendover, I went to Grand Island to get a change of clothing and called General Ed, said, "I would like to have Wendover. I like it." And I said, "Would you please call the 504th, Jim Conley, and tell him that I'm coming over to look at his 393rd Squadron?" So he said, "Go ahead." I got in my trusty flying machine, took off, and went over there. I didn't get the best reception. They were suspicious of me. I can't blame them. They took a good squadron away from a good group and left them holding the bag. But I liked what I saw. The records were good. I got to meet Tom Klassen. I liked Klassen, but I didn't tell him that. You can't flatter guys too much, you know. But anyway, with that, I went back. I didn't go back. I went down to Georgia, where my wife and son and a newborn was waiting me, and I thought maybe I could take a couple of days and play father, and so, all that kind of stuff. I left after 2 days down there because 393rd was coming into Wendover with the airplanes, equipment, ground crew, and all that sort of thing, so I thought I'd better get back. I did. I think you'll remember. You landed there, you felt the same as I did. What did I do to get punished this way? I tried my best at that particular time to persuade you that if we were successful, we would shorten the war. I don't know how well you believe me, but you at least didn't refute what I said. You had nothing to do. If we didn't have support there, we couldn't operate your B-29s at training, velocity or their status. So I thought, well, I talked to Bud Uwana. Uwana was the chief of security that beat me there. He was Jack Lansdale's man. I said, let's do something. He said, what do you want to do? I said, let's tell everybody they can have a furlough. Hadn't had one in a long time. I thought everybody would appreciate a furlough. That'd give us time to catch our breath and decide what we do next. Furloughs were accepted by a great many. I don't know how many, but not everybody, but there were a lot of men that wanted to go on furlough. Now, the hitch behind that, I told you two things. It gives the crews a break, the men a break, but it also gives us a chance to test whether or not we have a bunch of gabby folks or whether they're listening to us about this security business. You know, you can get in and out of Wendover very few ways. As I remember it, you could take a train from Wendover and go some places. You could go to Elko, Nevada and get another train or an airplane and go somewhere. You could go back into Salt Lake City and get a train, an airplane, or a bus and go someplace. We had a good security staff in there. I don't know how many of you guys know it, but with the people that were coming into that place, and some of them came in at the same time you men brought your airplanes and crews in, Lansdale put 22 agents in the organization. They were watching everything you did all the time. He asked me if you want to say, you want to know who they are? I said, hell no, I don't want to know who they are. I just want them to do their job. Okay. In this ruse of sending people out so we could check whether or not they were going to talk, we caught a few people. And when they got home, there was a telegram waiting for them telling them to return to Wendover immediately. When they came in, we briefed them. Yawana did. They were in my office, but Yawana said, now at this time you said so-and-so to somebody at such and such a place. Could have been in a bar. It was. In one case I know, one was in the railroad station. It was just fellas, I understood it to be normal exuberance of having somebody talk to them and would listen to what they were saying. I think that's really what it was more than anything else. So we got these messages out, and I think we got 4 men on that, and brought them back to Wendover. One at a time, we briefed them, and I said, I don't know what I want to do with you guys. It's against the law to shoot you, so you go to your barracks, and you're confined to the barracks and the mess hall until I can figure out what to do next. If I remember right, maybe some of you remember me differently, but I think it was something like a week. I let the sweat pour. Now, in the meantime, while it was going on, the other guys were there, said, you know, you went on leave. What the hell are you doing back here already? So they told him. That spread the word around that we were looking. Okay, we did a couple more dirty things. We tapped all the telephones. We read all the mail coming in and out to find out if was information being transferred. And I can assure you that there was very little of it. Now, we proved our point that way by making some kind of a comment, like we could tell a guy that his wife had written him a letter announcing that she was pregnant, or one of the kids had a problem, or anything else, but it had to be personal. And boy, you ought to see the mouth drop open and the eyes open up when they say that. They knew we knew that we knew what we were talking about. I never had any more trouble after that with security. Everything fell into place and worked just great. You guys, you know, you worked your butts off. We got more airplanes. When you came back to make an approach to land, you had to understand the problem that was inherent in going from water. Am I right, Tom? Going from water to land, and the trail of the bomb or something like that. You had to compensate for it a little bit. You invariably, if I'm not wrong, you stop short. You drop short, I should say. Okay. There was a little hanky-panky that went on down there, but we covered that up all right. Especially that water fight in the hotel. I would like to come around and talk just a moment about what I thought and what I saw that was going on with you men. At first, you were a little bit discouraged because you'd been pulled away from an organization where you knew everybody, you'd been doing quite well and so on. And you got into another situation which I would think confused you a little bit, but yet I saw the spirit there. You were determined to prove me wrong on several points, which I loved. I thought that was just great. I like to see, you know, competitive spirit exhibited. You did that. Now let's get to the month of April, because it's the next key move. When I was given command of the what turned out to be the 509th composite group. I was told by General Lentz, when that outfit is ready to go overseas, here is a code word. I forgot it. I couldn't write it down, and I forgot it. Here's a code word that you send to Washington, D.C. to the Adjutant General's office. It's the Adjutant General of the Army. And an inspection team will schedule to come in and check your men out, check your equipment, do everything necessary to clear you to go overseas. In other words, you're doing pretty good. You're in good shape there. When I saw that the Los Alamos people were continuing to test things that to me appeared to be working pretty good, I asked Dr. Oppenheimer, I said, what are we waiting for? He said, well, he said, we're doing all this fuse testing and so forth because I want to be sure that we are not going to have a misfire, an accident, or anything like that. I said, well, what are you looking for? He said, I want 1 chance in a million that will not be a failure. I thought, boy, that's pretty heavy odds. I said, what have we got now? He said, oh, we got 1 in 10,000 now. So, okay, you got 1 chance of failure in 10,000. I'm not a gambler, but I thought those were pretty good odds to take. I had a team that was ready to go. If I kept the team back, they would lose their spirit, they would become overtrained, and we wouldn't be anywhere. I wanted to get you out because I wanted to get the damn war over with as soon as I could. Now, that's a broad and a big statement, but we had the capability to drive that message home that the Japanese would find it rather futile to continue to fight with those things as return. I sent the message in when I got back. I didn't say anything to Dr. Oppenheimer about it, but when I got back, I sent this code word to Washington. In about 3 days, I got a call from General Lentz's office. Excuse me, not General Lentz. General Groves' office. Now, I had met General Groves. I'd done some things with him. I'd flown him different places, and I liked the man. I understood that he was a tough character, but he treated me perfectly fairly. And this call I got was from Mrs. O'Leary, his secretary. She said, General wants to see you in the morning. I said, okay, I'll get in an airplane and fly right in. I got in an airplane, a trusty old C-54, and flew to Washington. And went in his office the next morning, right after he'd gotten there, I guess. But I was in there by 9 o'clock. And Mrs. O'Leary said, he's busy. And I said, I'll wait. And pretty quick, Squawk Box said something. He asked him, is Tibbetts there yet? Yes, he is. Send him in. So I knocked on the door. He said, come in. I opened the door, saluted. I said, Colonel Tibbetts reporting as ordered, sir. And he looked at me and he said, what did you mean doing what you did? I said, what do you mean, sir? He said, sending in that message that you were ready to go to war. I told him just what I told you. I said, General, I had a good team. I'm ready to go. And I think that Los Alamos is playing games with us. As long as we keep those airplanes and crews there, they're going to continue to play. You know, you lose your toys, then you got to do something different. He looked at me and he says, well, he said, let me tell you one thing, and he used some harsh language. He said, I think you overstepped your bounds. Then he kind of smiled, but he said, you did something I couldn't do. He said, I couldn't tell Oppenheimer to, cut it out and go to war. He said, if something had gone wrong, Leslie Groves would be to blame. He said, you get by with it. I said, yes, sir. And I started, he said, that's all I got to say, except don't pull any more surprises on me again. Let me know ahead of time. Yes, sir, I said that. Now, the machinery was rolling for our final inspection from the IG's office. And they had many requirements. They checked personnel records. They did everything that concerns your pay matters, your allotments, and all of those types of things. They checked all of the personal equipment, all of the government equipment. Are you equipped the way you're supposed to be according to the TO&E and according to procedures as far as personnel are concerned? One thing that they required was that you advise all troops by a written letter posted on the bulletin board that the inspector would be there, and at such and such a day between the hours of one time and another, that they will listen to personal complaints. They had a complaint hour. Well, the team came in, and they were in there on the second day. They had, I think, by action, they had done what they wanted to do except have the complaint hour. The following day, by noon, the inspector was in my office, and he said, "You didn't follow such a regulation." I said, what do you mean, Colonel?" He said, "You didn't post the notices on the bulletin board about complaint hours." I hollered out the door for Tom Carnes. I said, "Tom, did you put the notices up?" He said, "Yes, sir. They're up in every orderly room on the bulletin board." I said, "Come on." Got the colonel. We started looking there. We went to headquarters back in the back there, looked there. There it was on that board. I don't know where we went next. We went to 3 different orderly rooms, and the colonel saw him, and he stopped after the third one. He said, "We're going home." He said, "I've been doing this for 2 years. I've never been to any organization that they didn't have one man come in with a bitch of some kind." He says, "You win." Man, did that make me feel proud. I thought, you guys are something else. And I still think so. Now, I want to wind this, I guess I'll call it a talk. I want to wind this thing up by saying that from the bottom of my heart, I think you are the best outfit that the Army Air Corps ever had. Never one like it. You never had a violation of security charged against you when every other outfit that was under the Manhattan District did. And I don't know, one thing I'll bring up is an incident. When we got orders to get ready for Hiroshima, and I don't know what it is, maybe Lou Shaper will remember better than I do, but I called Lou in because there was a big wooden box sitting out there on the no man's land, and it had attracted some attention. And I told Lou, I said, "Now put that thing over near one of the revetments and put one of your men on it to guard it, but tell him to go to sleep or act like he was asleep." And Lou did. Nothing was heard. In 1953, I was in the Air War College in a seminar. And a very pompous lieutenant colonel from the Adjutant General's Office of the U.S. Army came in along with one of the instructors to the seminar room, and this instructor said, "Colonel so-and-so wants to speak to you." He said, there's a seminar room right next to this one. You can go over there and talk to him. So I did. Well, all I can say is this man was all cocked and primed. He was pompous as hell. And he walked over to the seminar table, opened his briefcase, and he pulled out a picture and laid it down. He says, "Now explain that." And I started laughing. He said, "What are you laughing about?" I said, "I didn't know how long it was going to take me to see that damn picture, but I planted that thing there so I'd get somebody to take a picture of it." He slammed everything closed and walked out. Never heard any more about security. So, of all of the praise and so forth that I could put on you, I mean it seriously. I've told people, military organizations, I never saw one like you. You had a higher intelligence level than any outfit I ever heard of. You had more drive than any bunch of men that I ever knew. I don't know what else to say, but you're a hell of a gang. Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, it's time to come back to earth with a few mundane announcements. One announcement is that the hospitality room will be open tonight and tomorrow. There will be a news conference tomorrow, which is in your schedule, scheduled to start at 9 o'clock. And everyone who is interested is invited to come. That will be down in this, one of the rooms in this area. So I hope there's space for all who want to come. But anyway, this is a chance to see how the media operate. There will also be an open forum tomorrow afternoon. We're having a video made by Professor Anderson Giles of his recent trip to Tinian, in which he tried to find, and I guess did find, the areas where we were located, and took a number of shots, and has be a very interesting comparison with how things were in 1945. And I believe also that the Greenwich Workshop film will be exhibited. Furthermore, we'll have talks by some people from the various units of the 509th. So with that, proceedings are closed.
One last comment. The reception at the museum tomorrow evening is casual. I think it had been put out that it was going to be coat and tie, but please, the museum could be pretty warm. It's going to be hot tomorrow, so it'll be casual for the reception at the museum tomorrow evening.
Dr. James Hopkins is not going to. Is he here? Yeah, he is. Yeah.
What I would like to cover is some recollections that you have of the Nagasaki mission, and what you were seeing from your vantage point. You were actually in visual contact with Boxcar. You were in Great Artiste. Could you briefly run through the scenario of what you were seeing at Nagasaki through the time the bomb went off and what that looked like?
Yeah, well, this is, of course, a very memorable day for us, because this is the 50th anniversary of the Nagasaki mission, being August 9th, 1995. We were flying the instrument plane, the Great Artiste, on the Nagasaki mission after a couple of long waits, one being circling over Yakushima Island to try to make rendezvous with a third plane, which we never did. It took about 40 or 45 minutes. We then went on to Kokura, the primary target. And Kermit B. and the bombardier in Boxcar, which was carrying the Fat Man bomb, made 3 passes in the attempt to make a visual drop, but was unable to because of cloud cover and haze and smoke and so forth from a previous bombing by the 20th Air Force. So then we finally headed for Nagasaki, made a radar approach, and finally, I think the last 20 seconds or so, there was an opening in the clouds, and Behan did pick up a very prominent landmark on the ground, which was a circular stadium or racetrack, and that he used that as the aiming point, dropped the bomb. We were flying loose formation with him. We were maybe, I don't know, a couple hundred yards behind or something like that, and to one side. We saw the Fat Man bomb drop from the boxcar, and then my bombardier, Charles Levy, immediately released the 3 instrument packages that we were carrying. These packages were really sound wave or shock wave detectors, and they were suspended from parachutes and had radio equipment which radioed back the shape of the shock wave to the instrument plane. Where it appeared on 3 different cathode ray oscilloscopes, which were photographed to make a continuous record of the shapes of the shock waves. Now, of course, there was more than even 2 shock waves. The primary, first one being the direct shock wave from the bomb, which exploded at something like 1,800 feet above the ground level, and the second shock wave was a direct reflection from the ground around the bomb. Then there were some smaller shock waves reflected off the mountainous terrain around Nagasaki. Of course, the bomb dropped in the Urakami Valley area, which was the site of of very large Mitsubishi heavy industry and armament installations. So then we were flying directly, until the bomb dropped, we were flying in formation. Then we both peeled off in steep diving turns of about 150 degrees, which were calculated to put the maximum distance between the airplanes and the site of the explosion when the shock waves reached us. Of course, the first thing that happened was the flash of light, which was much stronger than the sun, so that we were flying at around 28 to 30,000 feet or so in broad daylight, but the flash of the bomb was very, very apparent to us, even though we were, well, Hugh Ferguson, co-pilot, and I were wearing welder's goggles, and we were flying away from the explosion, and still the cockpit was lit up by this tremendous flash of light. Then later, after we completed our escape maneuver, or diving turn, 150-degree turn, was when the shock waves hit. Of course, the initial flash of light and radiation was almost instantaneous, but of course takes the shock waves, which move roughly with the speed of sound, a while to reach our airplanes. And after that, we did circle around and observe the growth of the fireball and the mushroom cloud as it built up to our level, and then went even higher, up to, I believe, around 40,000 feet. But we were able to look down when we first turned to fly around the Nagasaki area. We saw the boiling mass of clouds. Really, it looked like a seething cauldron of purplish and various other colors moving upward, almost like something growing, boiling, rising up. We then now there were a number of photographs were taken from the plane that we were flying the Great Artiste, and some of the photos that have been most widely published, I think of the Nagasaki bomb, I believe, were taken from our airplane. Our tail gunner, Bob Stock, was given a camera, a motion picture camera, I believe, and he also took still photographs. We also had three men from Los Alamos who were flying with us, and Larry Johnston, who was in charge of the group of three, is here at the reunion today, and he spoke at the open forum meeting yesterday. And with him was T3 Walter Goodman, and then Sergeant Jesse Kupferberg, so that both the boxcar and the Great Artiste on that mission had 13 men on board. So I don't know whether you consider that lucky or unlucky, but we all survived, although it was, for the Great Artiste, it was a fairly close call, because for some reason or other they were unable to transfer about 725 or so gallons of gasoline in the rear bomb bay tank. It was originally thought when they took off that they wouldn't even need this extra gasoline, and it was there mainly to balance the load on the airplane, because of course the 10,000-pound Fat Man bomb was in the forward bomb bay compartment, and so it helped to trim the ship to have this reserve fuel in the rear bomb bay. However, for some reason or other, they were unable to transfer this fuel, which wouldn't have been a problem except for the long delay at Yakushima, waiting for this special camera plane, which had a so-called fast-ax camera on board, which was supposed to take pictures at something like it's hard to believe, but something approaching 10,000 frames a second. It was supposed to record the initial explosion and the fireball, but of course that plane never made the rendezvous, and as I say, we wasted about 45 minutes or so circling, waiting for him. Then we went on to the primary target, which was Kokura, and made these three runs, which were abortive because of the poor visibility. They had instructions to drop the bomb visually, I believe, or if unable to drop visually, to return to base, but at this point it became it would be impossible to fulfill these instructions. And so the decision was made on the boxcar to proceed to Nagasaki and to bomb by radar if necessary, because we could never bring the bomb back to base. So they did make this radar approach to Nagasaki straight from the Kokura area. And as I say, the clouds, there was a break in the clouds and in the smog and so forth, so that a visual drop actually was made, although it was a close. It might have had to have been dropped by radar if this break hadn't occurred. But by this time there was so much fuel used, particularly making all these circling and making these abortive passes, that the crew on the boxcar was very concerned about being even able to get to Okinawa, forget going back to Tinian. Okinawa was the closest base to where we were in Kyushu, and that was then the chosen landing area. So the two planes proceeded. Now we stayed with the boxcar all the way to Yantan Field on Okinawa, and of course the people on the boxcar can tell the story better than we can, because we were only flying with them, but I guess it really was a very close thing that the boxcar didn't have to ditch, because when they landed they claimed that there was very little gas in their main tanks. Of course, there was 625 gallons that they couldn't gain access to, but they did manage to land under emergency conditions, and so the mission was, from a point of view of military operation, was, I think, as successful as it could possibly have been, because where the bomb dropped did, I think, the maximum amount of damage to the military industrial capability in Nagasaki, which was largely, these huge Mitsubishi installations.
Okay, great. Now to go back and touch on a few things, you had William Lawrence in your plane.
That's right. Yeah.
Could you comment on his role and what were you talking with him? Was he talking with you? What was going on with Lawrence with you guys?
Yeah. Well, Lawrence, I believe, had originally hoped to go on the Hiroshima mission, but there wasn't any place for him. And he did get to Tinian, I think, rather late anyway, so he might not have been ready to go anyway. Anyway, it ended up that he was assigned to fly with my crew on the Great Artiste, and he did. And he was, I guess he was given a colonel's uniform, so in case he was captured, he wouldn't be shot as a spy or something. Anyway, of course, he was the only man accredited to the Manhattan Project. He was the science writer for the New York Times. He was also a special consultant to the Manhattan Project, and he had been privy to very, very much, if not practically all, I guess, of what was going on in the Manhattan Project all the way through. And he also, by the way, witnessed the Trinity test down in New Mexico, where we were the other day. Anyway, he flew with my crew, and he was right in the front area with us. He talked to various people. He talked to me, I'm sure. He talked to Hugh. He talked to Ralph Curry, who was a radio operator. He talked to Godfrey, the navigator, Levy, the bombardier. So there was no want of conversation, because he was interested in everything. And for one thing, I guess he was both interested and sort of scared by we had a lot of St. Elmo's fire, the static electricity that builds up and discharges in a purple glow along the propeller tips and along the wings. I guess he had never seen that before, because the whole mission had been changed from the original idea of going up to Iwo Jima and having that as a rendezvous point, as they had done on the first mission. But because of the weather fronts that had moved in even sooner than had been expected, we had to penetrate some pretty severe weather. And as I say, this occurrence of St. Elmo's fire was one thing he was very interested in, and everything else that went on, he was very curious.
Was he Do you have any recollection of his reaction once the bomb had, did he actually see Fat Man come out and he was witness to that?
Yeah.
Can you remember his reactions?
Yeah, well, he was right with us, you know, in the front of the airplane, and so there was, he saw, you know, as much as any of, of course, since we were in the front of the airplane, we were actually flying away from the explosion when it occurred. And Bob Stock had the best view, of course, because he was in the tail, so he was looking back towards the explosion, whereas we were, you know, headed away from it. But then when the shock waves were finished, and then we started circling around Nagasaki, then of course we could see this huge buildup of the mushroom cloud. And so he was right there. He saw it just as much as the rest of us, and he wrote about it. You know, his book Dawn Over Zero was one of the first accounts that was in book form that was written about it, and he talks in there at some length. And he eventually won the Pulitzer Prize largely on the basis of his reporting of that mission. Now he also made a preliminary report to the New York Times that appeared, I think it was September 9th of 1945. It was a delayed dispatch from Tinian, and this was his first account. Appeared in the New York Times about a month following the actual mission. But then he wrote Dawn Over Zero, and he later wrote some other books about his experiences in the Manhattan Project and flying with my crew on this particular mission. Now, an interesting point, though, is that in his book, so all the early publications said that the Great Artiste was the airplane that carried the bomb. But the giveaway in his book, and he says, yeah, it was the Great Artiste, you know, that carried the bomb. But the giveaway is that in his book, he says, yeah, I was observing this plane ahead of us with the number 77 on it. And of course, the nose art hadn't been put on, and that, of course, 77 was the so-called tactical number, or a Victor number of the boxcar. So you know, there's no question, but that he was misled like so many others until it was finally straightened out.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You being a commander of Boxcar, we're interested in what you would like to be remembered in a documentary sense about Boxcar and the crew of Boxcar and the camaraderie and the functioning of the crews and so forth.
Well, of course, most of the crew was put together quite a while before we had that particular airplane, because we were first formed up as a crew at Fairmont in Nebraska, Fairmont Airfield in Nebraska. We were in the 393rd Bomb Squadron, which at that time was part of the 504th Bomb Group, which was a conventional B-29 group. We were in training, getting ready to go to the Marianas. So we were a crew then, although there were a few changes. But then in September 1944, we were suddenly the whole squadron was suddenly transferred as a unit to Wendover and formed the combat nucleus of the 509th. So then we stayed together when we moved from Fairmont to Wendover, and continued as a crew. We flew missions in well, we did some flying in B-27 or B-17s, I guess, and B-24s because of the shortage of B-29s. Then we got some B-29s, which we used, including a period of a couple of weeks or so when we went down to Cuba and we're flying, you know, these B-29s, which were pretty much like the final B-29s. But then they said, well, and it's true. He said these B-29s that we were flying around weren't good enough. So then they made a whole new batch of B-29s at the Martin plant in Omaha, Nebraska, and then the boxcar. But actually, the boxcar was the second of the 15. I believe it was the second of the 15 B-29s that went to Tinian to be made. or to be assembled at the Martin plant in Omaha, Nebraska. And my crew actually we went up to Omaha and picked up the boxcar. It was at Offutt Field, which is right adjacent to the factory. We picked up that airplane, flew it back to Wendover. That was assigned. That was the airplane that was assigned to the crew. So we continued to fly it, flew it over to Tinian, and dropped pumpkins from it, and flew it back to the States eventually. And so in that sense, you know, it was our airplane. But of course, on this one mission, there was that one mission, there was an exchange of airplanes between the squadron commander, who at that time was Major Sweeney, and myself and our crews. So that's how it turned out.
How about a commentary from you on your crew, how you feel about their performance and the camaraderie that's kept you together all these years? I understand you guys meet every year, and not all the crews do that. There must be this extraordinary bond of camaraderie that exists.
Yeah,
I think we comment on that.
I think my crew always did, you know, sort of work well together, and we never, I remember, had any. I mean, some of the crews were, you know, much more, I would say, temperamental maybe than ours. Like Emily's crew was completely different. You know, they were a happy-go-lucky bunch. Ours, I guess, was pretty much, you know, straight. But I think we all, you know, respected each other's roles and got along and didn't take any unnecessary chances, and have continued to keep in touch over the years, and have really enjoyed, you know, maintaining our friendships. Unfortunately, another point is, of course, all 9 of the crew are still alive, which is sort of remarkable. But not all are by any means in good health. Hap Arnold, the engineer in particular, is in very bad shape from severe stroke that he suffered, and Charles Levy has suffered some strokes, but he's in much better condition than Arnold, and so that it's been a you know, a continuing relationship. But we had, I think, remarkably good performance out of the airplanes. And we flew not only boxcar. I think we flew I think three other airplanes in the course of our pumpkin missions and the Nagasaki mission. And we never had to turn back for an engine problem or malfunction. They were pretty reliable at that point. Of course, our B-29s had been considerably improved over, and of course, the early B-29s, but even the other B-29s that were being made about the time ours were, we had several modifications that improved the performance. For one thing, we had, you know, fuel injection instead of carburation on the engine, so the fuel was more evenly distributed to the 18 cylinders of those engines, and we didn't have severe overheating problems. And then the fact that all of the armament was stripped out of these airplanes except for the tail guns greatly reduced not only the weight of all this armament and the gunners that were required, but it also improved the streamlining of the airplane, because instead of having these turrets and blisters and so forth, we had much smoother surfaces and much less air resistance, so we could carry heavier loads, fly faster, higher, so forth. There are a number of other things, of course, like the reversible pitch propellers that were a great help in reducing the landing distance. You know, like slamming on the brakes. After you land, you put the propellers in reverse and then give some power to the engines. You know, and they act like a brake.
That feature probably saved Sweeney's crew when they landed.
Yeah, I guess they had a pretty rough landing after the Nagasaki mission. And
how did your name emblem come about? The famous boxcar that you see everywhere these days. Who thought that up, and who actually put it on the plane?
I know it's of course the crews. These were informal names. They weren't assigned names like the serial number. the serial numbers, of course, were signed by the Air Force at the time the airplanes were accepted from the manufacturer. And then the Victor numbers were signed by the group, and of course they were in large letters, and they were used not only so you could look at an airplane and see which one it was, but they were also used as radio call signals and so on. And so that the other names were informal, but by that time, towards the end of the war, most airplanes did have some kind of a name and nose art and so on. So I don't know, the crew, as I remember, the crew was sort of sitting around and talking about this, and I think it was Hugh Ferguson, and I think that maybe came up with this idea as a name because sort of play on the, a railroad boxcar, so they could carry a heavy load and so forth. But maybe they can tell better about this than I can.
Okay.
But of course, the nose art wasn't. I believe I may be wrong. I think that the name was chosen maybe before the mission, before we completed our combat missions. But the name and logo, and then the fat men that signified the number of combat missions that the crew had flown were put on, I believe, afterwards. I think after the war ended.
So the actual emblem was not on the plane during the mission over Nagasaki?
Yeah, and it couldn't have been because it has Nagasaki as part of the nose art.
I've often wondered about that.
Yeah.
So you actually had, all you had was your Victor number and the stars and bars emblem?
Yeah, the regular Air Force emblem and of course the prominent 77, which, of course, originally the airplanes only, the first few airplanes that got to Tinian only had single-digit numbers. Like ours originally was number 7. But then before the, I guess before the atomic missions, they, I guess to confuse the enemy, anyway, they made 2-digit numbers. So they added another 7 in front of our original 7, so we ended up at 77 rather than plane 7. And other planes were similarly, the numbers were changed because those were, were not serial numbers but tactical numbers.
Okay, another couple questions that I would like to ask you. What's been left out of the 509th story on a human level? I mean, there's endless documentaries on the 509th, the 2 strike missions, but talking to some of the guys here at the Reunion and members of other crews, you get all these other periphery stories and so forth, and I think to do a documentary work, you want to make sure that you try and cover something that maybe hasn't been covered before. And you being a major figure in the 509th and the atomic missions also, I'd be interested in hearing what you feel like has been sort of left out of the 509th story.
Well, one thing, and I mentioned this, I think at our press conference, was that there were actually 49 sorties in which a pumpkin bomb was dropped on Japan. Now, a pumpkin bomb was a 10,000-pound bomb, externally almost identical with the Fat Man bomb. So when a crew went up and dropped a Fat Man bomb, it was doing essentially the same thing as the crew did when it went up and dropped either Little Boy or Fat Man. The difference was inside the bombs and not what the navigator and the bombardier and the rest of the crew did. Of course, another thing that's not often brought out clearly is that in the Hiroshima mission, 7 of our B-29s were involved in the mission overall. And in the Nagasaki mission, there were 6 of the B-29s that were involved in various roles. Of course, at Hiroshima, there were the 3 weather planes, or advanced reconnaissance planes. And then there was the instrument plane, plus a plane that was equipped with a special camera. And then there was a backup plane that went up to Iwo Jima, because on Iwo Jima they had a loading pit like the ones on Tinian, so in case of a difficulty with the bomb-carrying plane, it was thought that they could go into Iwo Jima and then the bomb could be transferred to a backup plane, although of course it never that never came about. And it's interesting also that even though on the Nagasaki mission we bypassed Iwo Jima and flew up straight to Yakushima, that there was a standby plane that went to Iwo Jima. so that that made the 6th plane on the Nagasaki mission. Of course, in the Nagasaki mission, there were only primary and secondary targets, whereas in the first mission, there were primary, secondary, and tertiary targets. Of course, the secondary and tertiary targets on the Hiroshima mission were the primary and secondary targets on the Nagasaki mission.
Were you personally aware of the critical situation that was starting to unfold in Boxcar with fuel as it was approaching Nagasaki? Was there any communication between the two planes? Were you aware of what was developing?
Well, we were supposed to maintain strict radio silence, at least until the bomb had been dropped and we were well on our way back to base. There were a couple of well, one inadvertent transmission I believe occurred when Major Sweeney pushed the interplane instead of the intercom button on his radio controls, and so this message, as he tells it, and I have no reason to doubt it, went out all over Japan. Where is Bach? Because I guess we had gone from flying on one wing to flying on the other wing. Anyway, this message went out when it wasn't supposed to, and then and then I believe I know just when and also sometime during this, Major Hopkins and his crew, which had the camera plane, and never made contact or never got into formation over Yakushima, didn't know what was going on. And I believe that Major Hopkins sent out a message in the clear saying, "Chuck, where are you?" or something like that. And so this strict radio silence wasn't really maintained 100%, as I understand it. But then I believe that after we left the Nagasaki area, it's my recollection, I don't know how correct it is, that we did have interplane communication between Boxcar and the Great Artiste. And I believe, that they made us aware of their situation, that they were desperately low on fuel, and so we followed them all the way into Okinawa. And I guess the thought was, well, the Boxcar might well have to ditch, before it got to Okinawa, and if it did, we would be, we'd be there to report to the air-sea rescue teams or whatever, where it had gone down. So that's my recollection, that we were made aware of their fuel situation after we left Nagasaki and were headed for Okinawa.
One other point that I would like you to comment on would be the R.J. Stock took both motion pictures and still photos, and Godfrey also took still photos, I believe.
And Levy also, I believe, yeah.
Yeah. Now, when they landed, were they required to turn those in to the authorities, or were you allowed to keep the actual photos of the bomb going off? Because this was a highly sensitive event that had just happened. Do you know who they were turned into and who censored those? And
well, I'll let Len talk about that, because I wasn't involved directly in the picture taking. However, remember that there were three of these guys from Los Alamos with us. Now they brought cameras with them, and I believe that that one of the motion picture cameras, as I believe as Stock recalls it, that they approached me or something, with this camera and said, well, one of the crew members used this camera, and I believe that then they gave it to Stock, so he had this camera, but they also brought along some cameras that they themselves used, is best as I understand. So that of course these were I guess government equipment cameras, but I believe that Len and Chuck Levy had their own personal cameras, which they brought along. I didn't have a personal camera myself, and I don't think you did, but I believe that both that Len and Chuck did have their personal cameras and took some very good pictures. And of course, Stock did too with his personal camera, in addition to operating a motion picture camera.
A couple more questions, and then we'll move on to some of your other crews. I know you have a lot to do. Were you in any way astounded by the cloud, the explosion? I know you guys had not been, as I understand it, the motion picture you were supposed to look at the briefing was not played because the projector malfunctioned, so you saw still photos, and that's all you had ever seen before you actually saw the real cloud. Were you astounded at this spectacle? Was it something that was kind of incomprehensible? Could you comment on it?
Well, Yeah, I mean, it was just, you know, an awesome scene that, that one could hear about, but being actually there and actually seeing it is different from somebody telling you about it or even showing a picture of a similar event. Of course, there was a briefing after the July 16th test down at Trinity, but as you say, that apparently the motion picture equipment didn't work, and so we really didn't have. I don't think we had seen much of what it actually would look like until we saw it. Of course, we had talked to the other crew members after the Hiroshima mission, and then President Truman made. I remember I was sitting in the Quonset hut and hearing President Truman's broadcast, in which he said, you know, about the fact that this had been a revolutionary type of weapon, an atomic weapon, and so we learned, you know, something in advance of the mission. But as I say, it's quite different being there than hearing about it.
Okay, and I guess one other thing I'm interested in is, and a lot of people find it perplexing when they come here. A lot of the media people, when I was talking to them the other day, kept coming to me for some reason and asking me about this Greenwich Workshop situation where crew members have signed contracts, sort of like movie stars, sort of selling their memories and their knowledge. And I was wondering if you have I know you haven't, and you refused to sign that. I'm wondering if you would like to make some sort of a comment about how you feel about history being sort of used as a commercial enterprise.
Yeah, well, I have never done that myself, and I would rather maintain my control over what I say and do, and not have somebody tell me, you've signed this contract, you can't talk to somebody because you've got a contract that says you can only talk to me about this. And so I was approached by the Greenwich Workshop in the very beginning, you know, to tie up with them, and I flatly refused to do it at that time, and I'm glad that I did, even though I guess, you know, they've gained huge amounts of publicity out of it. I mean, it's this huge publicity machine. I mean, and then also I guess they've made some money out of it, but it hasn't been my choice.
Well, I talked to a lot of people about the 509th and the members and so forth, and there seems to be a great deal of respect for your decision. I don't know if you know that, or you know, a lot of people really respect the stand you took on that. I don't know if you hear that as it moves around and so forth. What I guess my last comment, and then we'll move on to the other crew members. What would you like to see the youth of the nation gain from the experience of Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and the 509th? What would be the legacy that you would wish the youth of this nation to gain from that?
Well, I mean, it was a concluding episode in the biggest war there ever has been, and it demonstrated, I think, clearly of the terrible destructive capacity that we now have, and that it ended or helped end this war. But it's also a warning that there better not be a World War III, or the devastation that's possible is almost impossible. It's hard to imagine what could be done with modern weapons, which are many, many times more powerful than the ones that were used. But then the knowledge of how to release atomic energy is, through the efforts of the scientists, has become well known, and so mankind's always going to have to live with this possibility of tremendous destruction. Certainly hope that some irresponsible or hate group doesn't get hold of the means of delivering such a weapon, but something we're going to have to live with from now on.
Any other comment that you would like to leave for the historical record here on the anniversary of this?
Well,
stop the tape for a second. Okay, go ahead.
To say is,
Go ahead, we're rolling, go ahead.
I mean, it's great for us, for the five of us to be in this room together. After 50 years to the day after we were flying together over Japan, and the years, I think, have been pretty good to most of us. But it is something that I'll never forget. I think this anniversary. I only wish that the other members of the crew could be with us, and I know they are in spirit.
Okay, wonderful.